Hey y'all, Mr. Irwin here. This is the screencast that I promised you. You'll recall in class, either on Thursday or Friday, depending on which day it was, we didn't quite get all the way through learning outcome number 5, where we were thinking about the connection between culture and memory. So just really quickly, I'm going to start with the pieces of research I gave you. We'll quickly evaluate the 2 new ones, and then we'll get on to some overall thinking about the topic as a whole. Bartlett you should already be pretty well familiar with, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip right past that one. Cole and Scribner talked about it a little bit in class, about the details of it. Just want to help you think a little bit about some of the strengths and weaknesses of it for those classes that we didn't get to that evaluation. So first of all, understand with Cole and Scribner, it's worth saying that it's a strength that the experimental method was used. There's a real attempt there to prove cause and effect, to set up a control group versus an experimental group. They did identify an independent variable. So that's worth mentioning. You're always trying to get as close as you can to showing cause and effect relationship. However, what was the independent variable exactly? We had 3 groups that differed in terms of their country, in terms of their educational background, and of course in terms of their culture. So was the independent variable education? Was it culture? Is education part of our culture? Is there any way to really separate those things? Hard to tell. And in either case, understand we're looking at a natural experiment. So the independent variable, which one would have to assume they were thinking was the culture of the different students, the independent variable is outside the experimenter's control. The experimenter couldn't randomly assign people to their nationalities and ethnicities. That means that compared to a true laboratory experiment, the validity of the results would be considered a little bit weaker. Also consider how definite, how fixed, how objective are the definitions for culture and for education. What exactly do we mean by those things? It's not easy to pinpoint a specific definition. And once again, that means that our results are always going to be kind of open to question. So, Cole and Scribner, the study may suggest that culture impacts memory, strongly even suggests that culture impacts memory, but the extent to which it impacts memory and the relative impact of culture compared to education is just not definite. This isn't like a chemistry experiment. Rogoff and Waddell, we also briefly mentioned that in class. You can see the details of it there. Once again, as far as evaluative thought, kind of the same thing as for Cole and Scribner. Again, it is a natural experiment. People were already Mayan or American before they showed up to be subjects. Once again, what's the independent variable, the impact of which we are trying to examine? Again, it's culture. Culture is a concept. It's not truly a measurable thing. So you'll remember at the beginning of the year we talked about how some sciences are called hard sciences, chemistry, biology, physics. Some are called soft sciences. One of those would be psychology. This is why. It's hard to measure exactly what we mean by culture. So the results are interesting. They suggest, maybe even strongly suggest, the influence of culture in what we remember, but no true cause and effect relationship can be, P-word, proved. Okay. Overall summary thoughts about culture and memory. Remember, your learning outcome begins with the command term discuss. So your job is just to talk about some different perspectives here. I'm not trying to prove anything. Well, let's start here. I wonder if you thought about this when I gave you time in class. Is there anything universal about how we as humans remember? Meaning, is there anything that really isn't boundaried by culture? Well, one thing that's universal is this. We all have the same brains. We all have the same hardware, quote unquote. That's universal. It doesn't matter what culture you're from. We have the same hardware inside of our skulls. But what's definitely different about memory, how we remember? Well, one thing, the specifics about how we remember. So in the Bartlett experiment, we can see how cultural schema control what we deem, what we decide is important, and thus what is worthy of being encoded in the first place. So culture, which impacts our schema then in turn impacts what we decide to pay attention to and what gets encoded at all. And then we can see in the Cole and Scribner experiment the actual methods that we use to encode information. So in that experiment, the two methods being compared, in a sense, were just a straight-up memorization of lists, aka free recall, versus encoding through storytelling. So the methods we use are different from culture to culture. And the specifics about what we remember. So later on, when we go to retrieve information from our long-term memory, specifics about what we remember, that too seems to be shaped by culture. Go back and look at Bartlett. Go back and look at Rogoff and Waddell. So think of Bartlett particularly. People might have remembered the basic outline of the story they were learning, but the subjects, because they were British, they would transform the words into more culturally British things. So the word canoe in the original Native American story went to ship or boat. Something else. Think about the supporting evidence regarding the importance of culture in our ability to remember. You might have noticed in Cole and Scribner, it's a good example, a lot of memory research that's been done has been done in cultures with formal school systems. So what does that mean for our topic? Well, ask yourself this: are the findings generalizable to cultures that don't do schooling? A lot of the psychological research on this topic has been done in Europe, the United States, Canada, quote-unquote Western societies with formal school systems. So that leaves open the question about what about societies and cultures that don't do that? Lastly, all the research studies that we've looked at, Bartlett, Cole and Scribner, Rogoff and Waddell, while they strongly suggest that culture plays a significant role in what we remember, how we remember, why we remember what we do, always remember this: they don't show a 100% clear cause and effect relationship between culture and memory. We simply can't prove that, ever. Why? Well, let's be specific. There are a lot of other factors that are involved in what we remember, which are not directly traceable to our quote-unquote culture. For example, you could be living in quote-unquote American culture and still have different personal, individual life experiences than other Americans. Your level of education. Again, you could be part of American culture. You are part of American culture. Does that mean that your education and your experiences in education would be the same as all other Americans? Of course not. What about something like just straight up inborn genetic ability? Could that influence what you remember, how you remember it, how quickly you remember it? It sure could. And these studies, these pieces of research into the relationship between culture and memory really don't and honestly can't take account for all of these different factors. So, in conclusion, it's very hard to say what I'm saying there in quotes at the end of the slide. It's hard to say culture determines, causes X% of human memory. We just can't ever really say that. The best we'll be able to say, looking at studies like we looked at here, is that there seems to be a pretty strong connection between culture and memory. That's about as far as we can go. All right, y'all, I hope this was helpful. Take some good notes on this. Remember, this is not something you're responsible for your test on Monday or Tuesday. Sorry about that. Monday or Tuesday, depending on which class you're in. But of course, you are going to be responsible for this potentially on the exam after Thanksgiving. And you certainly might be responsible for it in May. So make sure you take good notes. Let me know if you have any questions. See y'all later.